In this chapter, we will learn about inclusion and identity. Most people prefer group membership to isolation, but once they join with others, they find they must sometimes do what is best for the group rather than what benefits them personally. Groups blur the boundary between the self and the others. For members, they retain personal qualities, their motives, emotions, and outlooks, but add to them a sense of self that incorporates their collective rather than their individual characteristics. Groups transform the me into the we. Do humans by nature seek solitude or inclusion in groups? When do people embrace collectivism by putting the group's needs before their own? What processes transform an individual's sense of self into a collective social identity? First, let us answer the question, do humans by nature seek solitude or inclusion in groups? Baumeister and Leary suggest that much of human behavior is motivated by a basic need to belong. Solitude is sometimes rewarding, but most adults prefer the company of others. Most adults live with others, they spend most of their time with others, and an enormous number of groups exist. Putnam suggests that levels of social capital are decreasing due to reductions in involvement in groups, but the shifts he documents may indicate changes in the kinds of associations people seek rather than a reduction per se. People react negatively if excluded or isolated from groups. Participants in Life Alone studies conducted by Baumeister and colleagues indicate that the prospect of life alone triggers a number of negative social and psychological reactions in people. Ostracism or deliberate exclusion from groups is highly stressful as indicated by self-reports of negative affect as well as analysis of brain activity. Williams maintains that people respond both reflexively and reflectively to ostracism and usually exhibit one of the freezing, fight or flight, or tend and befriend responses. Extreme forms of violence such as mass shootings in schools have been linked to ostracism by groups. Individuals also react negatively to exclusion from computer-mediated interaction or cyber ostracism. The social meter theory of self-esteem developed by Leary explains that relationship between exclusion and self-esteem by hypothesizing that self-esteem provides individuals with feedback about their degree of inclusion in groups. Evolutionary psychology suggests that the need to belong resulted from natural selection as individuals who were affiliated with groups were more likely to survive. Next, let us answer, when do people embrace collectivism by putting the group's needs before their own? Individualism and collectivism are distinguishable in their relative emphasis on individuals and groups, with individualism stressing the person and collectivism the group. These two orientations adopting differing orientations with regards to interpersonal relationships, obligations, and self-conceptions. This concludes collectivism's emphasis on relationships is manifested in the emphasis on communal relationships over exchange relationships. The norm of reciprocity and the norm of equity are more consistent with individualism. The norm of equality, which is associated with collectivism. Social obligations, as described by Rousseau's concept of social contract and illustrated in the ultimatum game, are more central in collectivism. Self-serving tendencies are more likely in individualistic settings in contrast to group serving tendencies seen in collectivistic settings. A collectivistic orientation stresses hierarchy and reacts more negatively to non-conformity. Self-concepts differ in individualistic and collectivistic contexts, with greater emphasis on personal identity and greater emphasis on social identity or collective identity in the latter. Brewer distinguishes between two group-level selves, the relational self, and the collective self. Individuals differ in the emphasis on the personal and collective selves, with independence stressing individualism and interdependence putting their group's goals and needs above their own. Some individuals, too, seek individuation when in groups. Brewer's optimal distinctiveness theory suggests that individuals strive to maintain an optimal balance between their personal and collective identities. Cultures and subgroups within countries vary in their relative emphasis on individualism and collectivism. People who live in collectivistic cultures such as Asian, Eastern European, African, and Middle Eastern countries think of themselves as group members first and individuals second, whereas people who live in individualistic cultures such as Western countries are self-centered rather than group-centered. Some ethnic groups such as Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans are more collectivistic than individualistic. But research conducted by Twenge suggests that individuals may be shifting in a more individualistic direction. Let us answer the question, what processes transform an individual's sense of self into a collective social identity? Social identity theory developed by Todgepel, Turner and Hogg and their colleagues traces the development of collective identity back to two key processes, categorization and identification, that occur even in minimal intergroup situations. Social categorization involves automatically classifying people in two categories. Through self-categorization, individuals classify themselves into categories. Self-stereotyping occurs when individuals apply the prototypes or stereotypes of those categories to themselves. Identification involves bonding with and taking on the characteristics of one's groups. When people identifying strongly with a group, their self-descriptions become increasingly depersonalized as they include fewer idiosyncratic elements and more characteristics that are common to the group. Identification and categorization become more likely when outgroups are salient and when people are members of smaller groups. Self-esteem is shaped both by individuals' personal qualities and by the perceived value of the groups to which they belong. Those who join prestigious groups often have higher collective self-esteem than those who belong to less positively valued groups. Individuals who identify strongly with a group, such as sports fans, experience the group's outcomes as their own. By basking in reflected glory, individuals can stress their association with successful groups. By cutting off reflected failure, they minimize their connection to stigmatized or unsuccessful group identities. Individuals are motivated to protect both their individual and collective self-esteem. Members of stigmatized groups, failing groups, or groups that are derogated by non-members often protect their collective self-esteem, as defined by Crocker and colleagues, by rejecting negative information about their group, stressing the relative superiority of their group, the in-group-out-group bias, and selectively focusing on their group's superior qualities or social creativity. When stereotype threat is high, members become concerned that they will stereotype if considered a member of a particular group. Individuals may minimize their association with groups that are performing poorly or resign from the group or the individual mobility.